So I got a comment from somebody on one of my videos asking if I could do a video or just clarify an idea or a concept for them. And the subject itself was very interesting. And I'm going to read the comment and then I'm going to explore everything. So it says, "Hi Chris, recently I told you about the concept of IFS therapy. And in a nutshell, the goal is to connect to the true self. And what I think you are referring to as unhealthy self-identity is over-identifying with a protective part that thinks is the self, but is actually a part of the true self. And I think the real self naturally has the individuation, differentiation, and healthy boundaries. What do you think about my statement? And do you think that only feeling the repressed emotions from our traumas so we can access the self?" Yeah, this is very interesting. And I think that I have a really beneficial way to explore it. And doing so, I'm going to contrast healthy childhoods with survival-based childhoods. And I'll make it very clear again, first and foremost, that there's no such thing as a perfect childhood. There's no such thing as a perfect parent. There's no such thing as a child that comes out of childhood without any trauma. That's the reality of it. But there is a drastic difference between a survival-based unhealthy childhood and a healthy childhood. The fascinating thing about the comment is that it consists of the word true, which, of course, its opposite would be false. And I'm going to do what I can to avoid any black or white thinking here. I'm going to try to approach this with as neutral a standpoint as I possibly can, but I think I understand what's being asked here. And actually, I'm going to utilize codependency. I'm going to utilize people-pleasing because I think that that's something that's very well understood by a lot of people. I'm going to utilize that to explore this because I think it will be helpful. Codependents, people-pleasers, are birthed in survival-based, unhealthy childhoods. In childhoods with fight, flight, freeze, fawning. It's in the description. In a survival-based childhood, sometimes children learn fawning. They learn people-pleasing. That in and of itself is a defense mechanism. Looking at a survival-based childhood, fight, flight, freeze, fawn are all defense mechanisms. They're unhealthy defense mechanisms, but they're still defense mechanisms. They are defense mechanisms to allow the person, unfortunately in an unhealthy way, to defend themselves against whatever emotional pain is present in the environment. If somebody is a codependent, if somebody is a people-pleaser, people-pleasing is fawning. People-pleasing is codependency. It is an unhealthy defense mechanism that was learned in a fucked up survival-based childhood with fight, flight, freeze, fawn. The word is right there. In a survival-based childhood, a person did not get healthy boundaries. They did not get individuation, and they did not get differentiation. And say, for instance, what they learned to do the best was to fawn, was to people-please, was to be codependent. They learned that their self-worth was entirely dependent on how well they could please people, on how well they could emotionally caretake people. The fascinating thing is how much of this drive has to do with self-worth and where in the survival-based childhood the self-worth was placed. In a healthy childhood, the child learned intrinsic, internalized self-worth. They learned that without doing anything, they're just worthy. And no, this doesn't really lead to entitlement. It leads to a healthy sense of self because it teaches you that your worth is not based off of performance. It's based off of who you are. And the entitlement dynamic actually comes from a lack of healthy boundaries. Because think about it. If you feel entitled to anything, it means that you weren't taught a very important foundational understanding of boundaries. What is yours, what isn't yours, what you get from people, what you don't get from people. It's a very fascinating structure, very fascinating dynamic. And so, in the survival-based childhood with fight, flight, freeze, fawn, as a defense mechanism against the reality that, oh shit, you learned that your worth is tied to the external, tied to something or someone out there, but in this case specifically, tied to who you are being, based around what other people want from you. It's painful as fuck to see yourself as not inherently, internally worthy, determined by the self, taught to yourself by your parents that were healthy, because they weren't. It's exceedingly fucking painful to discover that your worth is, I mean, it might be unconscious, subconscious at that point, but it's still painful to discover that your worth has to do with something out there. I mean, imagine how much people exhaust themselves doing things that they don't actually want to do. People pleasing. You don't realize it until you get out of it and understand that you don't actually have to do that in order to be loved. You've just been exhibiting behavior that is not, let me make it very clear, is not good or bad or right or wrong. It's not good or bad or right or wrong to be a people pleaser. It's just not healthy, because you're allowing your boundaries to be violated and you're violating other people's boundaries as well. It's not your responsibility to emotionally caretake anybody. That's their boundary. For somebody to be emotionally regulated is their responsibility. Consider yourself a narcissistic extension of them to regulate their emotions. Yeah, you're putting yourself all in their boundaries, and neither of you are aware of it because of the level of, I would say, unconscious self-awareness you're operating at. Again, it's not good or bad or right or wrong, it's just not healthy. But that's why it's important to understand the difference and dynamic of health versus unhealth. Healthy versus unhealthy. So, while trying to keep this as neutral as possible and not dive into the dynamic of true versus false self, I would argue that it has so much less to do with true versus false and has so much more to do with healthy versus unhealthy self. So if what you want to do is connect to your healthy self, well, quite honestly, if you just went through an entire decade and then beyond that of starting with a survival-based childhood of fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and what you learned to do in order to receive worth, in order to receive love, approval, validation, acceptance, was to become a people pleaser, to become codependent, to learn to be a narcissistic extension of other people, to emotionally caretake them, and that was the only way that you would receive love, validation, approval, acceptance. That's fucking painful. But the fascinating thing is that so many people that are caught up in that reality are actually unaware that they don't have to do that, and that they can, in fact, be loved for an authentic version of themselves. Codependency is not authentic because you're doing things that you might not even realize you don't want to do. What you want is the love. What you want is the approval. What you want is the validation and the acceptance. What you're doing is essentially a defense mechanism. People pleasing it is a defense mechanism. It's not authentic. It's not healthy. It's not bad. It's not wrong. It's just not healthy. So people usually, I'm going to go back to the word protective here, the protective part of the identity, the protection, the shield, the defense mechanism is people-pleasing. You might see it as your identity and identify with it, but the very reality is that it was an unhealthy learned defense mechanism from a survival-based childhood. With fight, flight, freeze, fawn. Fawning is people-pleasing. It's a defense mechanism. Oh shit, I've got to please a bunch of people. I've got to emotionally caretake a bunch of people just to be loved and accepted and validated and approved of, just to be acknowledged, just to be seen. So many times people get caught up in these defense mechanisms because it's the only way that they've learned to be seen, the only way that they've learned to be acknowledged. Like, imagine that you are only seen by people if you are a people pleaser, if you are codependent. You learn that that's your identity. The thing is, it's unhealthy. Because one, you might not realize, if you do actually want to do it, if you do want to do it, you can do it. You can do whatever you want to. If you choose to continue being a people pleaser, being codependent, and allowing your sense of self-worth to be entirely based on the external, based on being a narcissistic extension of somebody else and emotionally caretaking them, and deriving your sense of self from that, you can do that. You can. You're allowed to. You have free human agency. You have whatever choice you choose to make. That's the reality of it. However, that does not change that it is an unhealthy endeavor. And so this protective part, I'm going to utilize this defense mechanism of fawning, of people-pleasing, of being codependent. It's a defense mechanism. It's not authentic to who I am. I am at a level of conscious, I would say, unawareness, because I'm not aware of so many more things, aware of the reality that I could actually let go of this unhealthy defensive behavior and heal these parts of myself that were fragmented, because I learned in a fucked up childhood that the only way that I could be loved, approved of, validated, accepted, was if I was a narcissistic extension of somebody else, and I was there for the sole purpose of emotionally caretaking them, making sure that they were okay. That was never the person's job. They just learned that as their role in the survival-based childhood. So, yes, you would learn to identify as that. You would learn to identify as the codependent, the people pleaser. But, one, it's not healthy. Two, the likelihood that you would discover that it's also not authentic at some point, depending on how aware you become of yourself and everything, is very high. It's just a protection against the painful reality that love is entirely dependent on these things, which you would only learn in a survival-based unhealthy childhood with fight, flight, freeze, fawn, where you did not get healthy boundaries, you did not get individuation and differentiation. No, you were taught that in order to fucking exist, you had to become somebody that you didn't even want to. All of the fucking repression, everything that you pushed out into the shadows. Listen, you're not fucking acceptable as you are. You're going to get rid of that stuff and push it out into that is unacceptable in this fucking household. Your grandparents didn't do that, yada yada, so on and so forth. Essentially, the family system that you were raised in didn't have healthy boundaries, because if they did, they would have allowed you to be who you were, and they would have loved you for it. And you wouldn't have learned all of these fucked up survival-based defense mechanisms that are actually exceedingly fucking unhealthy and lead to a life of unfulfillment and inauthenticity. The survival-based self, the fawner, the people pleaser, the codependent, is inauthentic. But it is entirely built around the belief, the learned belief based on the childhood dynamics that you can only be loved if you emotionally caretake people, if you people please, if you do things that you do not want to do, if you basically become an inauthentic version of yourself. That is the only way that you will be loved. And what do we desire? What do we crave? Love. So imagine that. Imagine that you learn that the only way that you can be loved is if you fit yourself through this tiny fucking thing right here. You gotta squeeze yourself through it. You've got to do a bunch of things that you don't want to do. You've got to shed a bunch of authenticity, push that shit out into the shadows, and essentially become somebody that you are so identified with. Oh yeah, sure, I'll do things that I don't want to do just to receive love. Oh yeah, sure, I'll become somebody that I don't want to become just to receive love. When you were a child, you weren't aware of it. You would never do that as an adult who is consciously, exceedingly self-aware. This is the sad reality of childhood trauma, is that none of this stuff could even be a possibility in adulthood for somebody who was raised in a healthy childhood. It is the lack of awareness. Obviously, children are unaware. They're like sponges. They soak everything up. They're like parrots who learn everything that their caretakers teach them. And it's sad. So just to go back to it, the true self here is really what would unfold in a healing dynamic, where you learn to shed all of the layers of the survival-based conditioning, all of the layers of the defense mechanisms that are unhealthy. You learn that the very reality is that, oh wow, I don't have to be codependent. Oh wow, I don't have to be a people pleaser. Oh wow, I can shed all of these things that I've come to learn are actually unhealthy and, just defense mechanisms, inauthentic. That's the beauty. That's the beauty of this entire reality of healing, is becoming aware that you've been doing a lot of things throughout your life that are inauthentic and unhealthy and have actually led to further pain inside of you. Because even though many people have been taught that self-sacrifice is fucking honorable, yeah, let's see it for what it is. You learned in childhood that you had to sacrifice parts of yourself and push them out into the shadows, shadow work, in order to become a fucking cooked up, half-baked version of something that your fucking narcissistic parents wanted you to become, rather than what it was that you actually wanted, rather than what it was that the little you in the magical world of life was discovering about yourself. No, that wasn't accepted. That wasn't acceptable by your parents. So you pushed it out, and you essentially conjured up this version of yourself that was covered in unhealthy defense mechanisms like people pleasing and codependency. And so if you're looking at it from the sense of the true self, just to give a bit of a gateway here to an understanding in this sense, true self I see paralleled to authentic, healthy self. Who have you been and why? Is who you have been something that feels authentic to you, something that feels healthy to you, or is who you have been something that you don't look forward to getting up to every day? When you approach your relationships, do you feel like you're doing things that you don't actually want to do, but you feel like you have to because you feel like if you don't have to, you're going to lose people that are actually unhealthy and are actually just a further reinforcement of the fucked upness of your survival-based childhood? I will parallel true self to authentic, healthy self. I will also parallel protective self to survival-based self. Now, pain is going to be there in life. Things are going to happen that cause us emotional pain, but there are such things as healthy defense mechanisms. Being creative, being productive, sublimating pain through the process of artistic creation. It is, however, unhealthy to be a people pleaser and to allow your boundaries to be violated in doing things that you don't want to do just to please other people, because that's the way that you learned to be loved. There are people out there that have healthy boundaries that are individuated and are differentiated. And they will not pressure you to be somebody that is authentic to you just to receive love. That's the reality of it. So understanding that in over-identification with the protective self, in this case an unhealthy defense mechanism like people-pleasing, it's really more so about getting in touch with what it is that you actually want to do. Do you actually want to people please? And your immediate answer to it might be, well, yes, of course, because That's how I receive love. That's how you learn to receive love in an unhealthy childhood, a survival-based childhood with people that lacked healthy boundaries, individuation, and differentiation, and they did not allow you to be anything other than a fucking narcissistic extension of themselves. So yeah, that became hardwired. You learned that really fucking well. See it for what it is.